you have this sense of, well, hang on a second, this is something that's being basically controlled by the Chinese government, and any Chinese company is ultimately controlled by the Chinese government. And it's in our country, and it's important in some way. There's going to be 10 more of these things. They may not even be Chinese. We need to think in a kind of systematic way. Well, what do we think about a world in which our teenagers are using stuff that doesn't come from our country?
If we just double click on this ARM topic, right? I mean, it's not your traditional software tech, which we'll talk a lot about on the show. But what was interesting to me is deals announced Sunday. Boom, right away, you've got not one, but two founders saying, hey, there's real concerns here about should the UK allow this? Or at the very least, if it is approved, we should have restrictions on it, right? To help make sure that jobs stay in the UK, to help ensure that Britain has some strong kind of trade bargaining power with the United States. And you draw that line of comparison to what's going on with TikTok and the United States, India to a certain extent. Do you see similarities there between this idea of kind of tech protectionism now coming to more Western democracies?
Yeah, I think I kind of unpick this. I think there's two kind of very, very distinct issues here. I mean, one of them is a sort of sensitivity in the UK around creating kind of very important primary technology, and it's sort of getting bought and leaving the country. And so you saw sort of the same thing with the Google acquisition of DeepMind, for example, a couple of years ago. And why aren't we creating big giant trillion-dollar tech companies in Europe? So that's sort of one strand within that. There's also, frankly, a whole bunch of other conversations around the ARM acquisition, around sort of, there's an antitrust question, and, sort of sense of what happens if ARM technology is no longer sort of Switzerland, but instead becomes part of a lot of the company that competes with a lot of its customers. There's a bunch of interesting conversations around ARM, really, for semiconductor analysts and me, frankly. I think the TikTok thing is much more sort of, I think there's much more sort of profound geopolitical questions in here, because, I wrote about this the other day, that if you go back to like the Sputnik panic, and ever since then, the USA has had this sort of very strong idea that it should kind of be a kind of a global leader in technology, particularly because people sort of looked at Sputnik and thought, oh my God, they could drop atom bombs on us. But there's sort of the sense that America should be a global leader in technology, and by and large, it sort of has been. And there was a brief panic in the sort of 80s around Japan. But that, A, faded away pretty quickly. B, Japan is, when all said and done, half the size of the USA. It's half the population. So if Japan gets as rich as America, well, it'll be half the size. Same per capita GDP, it will be sort of half the size of America. And also, for all that, VCRs and, TVs and Walkmans are really cool, they're not like a means for influencing elections, or, spying on people. They're just TVs. They weren't really anything more than that. Same with cars, in a sense. Whereas now China poses a geopolitical threat to the USA, and there's a sort of plausible argument that says on a sort of 2050 to 2100 view, China will be, a larger economic and military power than the USA on any basis. I mean, today economists argue a lot about what Chinese GDP really means, but all things being equal, if China doesn't screw up, then in 50 or 100 years, China should be bigger than America, in the same way that America is bigger than Britain or Germany, because you've got way more people and you're a much bigger country. And there's a sort of anomaly of the last 100 years in which the USA was the biggest economy, because India and China, despite having more people, were not industrial economies, and that anomaly may be over. And so there's a sort of a moment of, oh my God, deer in the headlights moment of sort of reaction to that in the USA. And you see that in all sorts of fields. I think when you then apply that to something like Huawei or Tencent or TikTok, you have this sense of, well, hang on a second, this is something that's being basically controlled by the Chinese government, and any Chinese company is ultimately controlled by the Chinese government. And it's in our country, and it's important in some way. And so Huawei, theoretically, you can use telecoms equipment for espionage, but it's also do you want a piece of primary infrastructure dependent on the goodwill of the Chinese state? I mean, if the only electricity transformers you could buy came from China, you wouldn't actually be worried about spying. You'd be worried about them just not selling you any next year. And then you have a major problem. The same thing, Tencent is a panopticon and a censorship system. So Tencent, there's obviously kind of questions around, well, not Tencent, but WeChat. And TikTok, and you can look at it and say, well, look, it's just videos. It's YouTube on mobile. It's better YouTube on mobile. It's YouTube 2.0, which is it's not a social network, actually. There's no messaging in there. They don't really know who you are. They're not reading your email, and on an iPhone they can't read your email. But on the other hand, like if YouTube was for sale, what would you think about the Chinese government or Chinese company buying YouTube? What would you think about Chinese company buying Netflix? Which again, the Chinese. What would you think if the Chinese government had indirect control over Netflix or indirect control over Viacom? Say, and the US doesn't let foreign citizens own US TV stations, which is why Rupert Murdoch had to convert to American citizenship, which of course meant that he then wasn't able to create a wildly populist TV news station that would kind of have a major influence on US democracy. And so, there's reasons why, real reasons why one would worry about this stuff. And I think some of the initial reaction in the US, indeed, frankly, in the US tech press, was sort of, this is just Trump being an idiot again. And there's certainly a layer to that, and certainly the way the process was handled was not anybody's idea of good government or due process or anything else. But I think people's eagerness to think about Trump sort of masks them to how much China has changed in the last 5 to 10 years and what it means to say China would own this now as opposed to what it might have meant to say China owns this 5 or 10 years ago. And so
absolutely.
At the core of it, there's a sort of a real concern there. I think, and I'll sort of say one more thing and then sort of pause for breath, but I think the other challenge here is it's not like TikTok is the only one. There's going to be 10 more of these things. They may not even be Chinese, but presume for the sake of argument they are. It's like there's 800 or 900 million people in China with a smartphone now. More people in China have a smartphone than in the USA and Western Europe combined. And there's an awful lot of software innovation in China. And so the next cool thing might be in America, but it might not. And so how do you think in a sort of systemic, repeatable way about the next cool thing that all American teenagers or all British or all German or Spanish or Brazilian teenagers want to use coming from not America? Might be Turkish, might be Indian, might be Vietnamese, probably Chinese. You need a kind of a rule for the next 10 of these. You can't just kind of fire off ad hoc executive orders over each one. You need to think in a kind of systematic way. Well, what do we think about a world in which our teenagers are using stuff that doesn't come from our country? And of course, the irony, of course, is that everyone else in the world has had to deal with that for 25 years. It's just that it was American. And you're seeing a whole other side of this, which is, Europeans and Australians and Japanese and everybody else going, well, the last 25 years, we kind of let the internet run by default on American rules. And now that doesn't work anymore because it's important. And so we're going to have our own rules around how this stuff works. And that's kind of the other side of the kind of the TikTok story is, what the EU part rules the EU or the UK or Australia parts. And so we moved from a world where it was theoretically a global internet, but in practice it was a San Francisco internet that everybody else used, to a world in which everybody else sets their own rules too.
Hi, this is Alex from Winner Take All. Thanks for joining us. Hope you enjoyed the content. Feel free to leave a comment, ask us questions, and definitely make sure to join us on our next live stream.